So the first thing to talk about is we have what's called the optimal working distance tool. So if you press and hold the silver button on the controller, you can change what objective you're using. In this case, I'm using the +4, and we have this tool called optimal working distance, and fundamentally what this does is it allows us to know what height to actually be using the microscope at. So everything stays in focus as we zoom in and zoom out. So I can see here I've not at the right height. I'm going to adjust my base down, my column, using those focus wheels on the back, try to get it in focus. That looks pretty good. We always want to have this setup be slightly lower than the part we're going to be looking at. And the reason is this allows the autofocus range to be able to move in and out. So I'm going to go ahead and hit OK. The microscope's going to zoom in a little bit further. I'm going to go ahead and use those focus wheels on the back to fine tune it. Looking at my maple table, that looks good. And now that's it. So now we can easily zoom in, zoom out, and the system's going to stay in focus as we work on it. Another thing you're seeing me do is I'm using what we have as a foot switch, and that allows me to do hands-free operation without needing, if I'm maybe looking at pins or other things, it's hard to oversell how helpful that foot switch is. And that foot switch is compatible with any system we've ever made. So whether you're a new customer or an old customer, we do have a foot switch option for you if you like what you're seeing with this capability. Next thing to talk a little bit about is zooming and how to control the autofocus. So let's say, for example, I was zoomed in here. Maybe let's go back to those capacitors over here. I'm zoomed in, I'm doing an inspection. Again, this is all at 9.8 inches, which I think is just great. But you can see that maybe I'm more interested into the top of this capacitor, but it's not the autofocus, I'm fighting it. So what I always train on is to remember to click the plus and minus button at the same time, whether it's on the foot switch or the hand controller, and this turns off the autofocus, and we're now in manual focus mode. And by doing this, we can actually take control of the board, of the focus motors ourselves, and do adjustments. The higher your magnification, the finer the movement of those focus motors. You can also, with this mode turned on, with autofocus turned off or manual focus turned on, it now behaves like a traditional microscope. So you can lift the part up and down to try to bring it in focus. So what I always train is the second you find yourself fighting the autofocus, go ahead and just turn it off by clicking the plus and minus button, and then either use the focus motors themselves or just lift the part up and down like you would a traditional microscope. Okay, and now the third big tip for anyone either using a TAGARNO or have considered a TAGARNO is how to control the auto exposure. You can see that here I get a lot of really good detail of the board, but in the metal I don't really see a lot of detail. You can see it on these solder heels, for example. So what I can do here is if I come into my hand controller, I leave it in auto exposure. You change your exposure modes by clicking the silver button one time. You flip between auto and manual. In this case, I'm going to flip it back to auto, and you can adjust the trim, the auto exposure bias, if you will, by using the left and right buttons on the controller. And so this can be really helpful if you wanted to, for example, see detail in this dark area. You want to amplify it. Maybe this is a better example. And if you wanted to see areas, or you wanted to control the auto exposure for more of this bright metal, turning it down works a lot better too. So those are kind of the three biggest tips is to remember is to set the working height using the optimal working height. Remember to turn off the auto focus when you start fighting it, and then to know how to adjust the trim of your auto exposure so you can actually see the details that you're interested in. If things look too dark or too bright, you can just turn it down. And I do recommend leaving auto exposure turned on because our system, as you zoom in and zoom out loud, the lighting intensity just changes due to the optics. It's just best to leave it set to auto.